In our last session, I spoke some words to those who, as we say, sit in the pews. And in this session, I'd like to speak some words to those who stand behind pulpits. And there's a lot to say here, and I want you to understand that I'm talking about a system that's been in place for a long, long time, and I'm not talking about the individuals who occupy that system, because obviously there are many wonderful people in the system, but the system is the problem, and that's what I'm talking about. And I'd like to just share with you a teeny bit about my own story. I was not a believer early on in life. I became a believer at age 20 in 1965, and I went off to Bible school, and then I went off to seminary. And while I was in Bible school, the Lord brought a book into my hands called New Testament Order for Church and Missionary by Alexander Hay, that was first published in 1946. And that book opened my eyes to some things, and it showed that the one-man pastor doctrine was incorrect. And so I never embraced that from that point on. I didn't think it was right. And so I never wasn't really, as it were, headed for the pastorate in the traditional sense. And then after finishing at college, then I went off to seminary. And my wife and I were planning to go to India. And so I was planning on spending one semester at the seminary and then going off to India. But they turned our visa down, so I ended up finishing at seminary in Philadelphia. So I haven't really been a pastor myself in the traditional sense, although I was a pastor for a couple of years. But it wasn't exactly the typical pastorate, but it was that's a long story, of course. But in any event, I know what it is to be a pastor, and I know I've been through seminary. I know what goes on there. And so I just like to share with you some thoughts concerning those who occupy the position of pastor, and urge you to consider the perspectives that I'm presenting. The goal, it would seem, according to many evangelicals, is to go by the book. And most churches have a constitution that says that the Bible or the New Testament is our final rule of faith and practice. And so I have come to have a real question and problem with that, in the sense that it seems like people say that, but when it comes to actually practicing what's in the New Testament, then it seems like there's a big chasm between the confession and the reality. And so my question is, if we claim to want to go by the book, then why is it that things that are in the New Testament are ignored in our church practice in most cases? And that would be, as we spoke of in one of our previous sessions, 1 Corinthians 14. And we have there an open meeting, and each one of you has a song, a hymn, a teaching, whatever, and it's an open gathering. And Paul's rule is, let all things be done for edifying and building up. So my question is, why have we replaced 1 Corinthians 14, which is some revelation in the New Testament, with a church service that has no touch with what is in the New Testament? And at the center of the traditional church service is the pastor's sermon. And so I'm asking this very seriously. Why do we exalt that for which there's no evidence, and then we suppress that by ignoring what is in the New Testament? Why do we not practice open gatherings where the saints can share Christ with one another and edify one another and thrill one another with the Lord Jesus Christ? Why is that? And of course there's, I think, many reasons why, and church traditions have choked out 1 Corinthians 14, and other things have replaced it. So my question to you is it valid to do that? And are we perhaps missing some great blessings by not paying attention to the revelation in that chapter. And I'm just focusing on that chapter. There's other evidence, but that's the main one. So when we think about how the sermon became central in church meetings, where does that originate? And we discover that it comes from the Greek philosophy in the 250 to 400 AD time frame, and that in the early church there's no evidence of preaching as we conceive of it in the meetings of the body. Rather, it was open gatherings. The preaching in the New Testament, the verbs used for preaching, refer to activity outside the body to people who are unbelievers. And so the proclamation of Christ to unbelievers is called preaching in the New Testament. And there's nothing about preaching being central in the gatherings of the body. Why do we have a pulpit? Why is everything directed toward the crescendo of the sermon? Why is that? Well, the answer is Greek philosophy, Greek rhetoric. That's where it all came into the church, and it's been practiced ever since. So I think we need to question that. Why are we exalting that for which there's no evidence in the New Testament? Why have we focused on something that is not there, but we haven't focused on what is there? So I think this is important consideration for us. Just think of all the time that's spent by pastors working on sermons, and how late night Saturday and all of that, is the sermon preparation. And I'd ask you to think about all the time that's spent on that. Yet, really, how profitable is it to the people? And why, and what makes us think that Christ wants a sermon to be preached in every church gathering? And to me, we need to reevaluate the centrality of the sermon. It just has no basis, and yet pastors spend a lot of time, on sermons. And so I'm suggesting maybe there's better ways to spend our time. Maybe we'd better to spend our time with people and develop relationships and help them in Christ rather than to focus on giving a monologue every Sunday. And of course, something that's very clear, unfortunately, is that the pastorate is a very risky profession, and there have been many, many books and studies done to show how the pastorate is a very, challenging thing, and it affects the pastor's family and himself or herself, and so we need to think about that. Paul said the body is not one member, but many. But the way we practice church, it basically ends up being that the church is one member, not many. And so the pastor's vision is really what drives the church. And so I think we need to ask ourselves, why do we do this when there's more in the New Testament about 58 one another's than there is about anything about preaching? And I'd just like to read you some quotations about the riskiness of the pastorate. This is just from, I got this about 10 days ago in a magazine in the mail, and the writer says, the statistical evidence of new clergy burnout within 3 to 5 years is alarming. Then later he says, a time when burnout is the first 3 to 5 years, in the first 3 to 5 years, has become so prevalent. So that's sort of a warning sign that something is going on here. Here's another statement from another magazine that I just got in the mail. Staff members and teachers long for the pastor to lead the charge because they understand the breadth of his pulpit influence. Everyone sees the value of developing generational gladiators, but too often the commander, the pastor, is absent from training, leading, and fighting. And then it goes on to say, until an initiative is important to the pastor, it will likely remain unimportant to the congregation as a whole. Just as kids take cues from parents, parishioners take their cues from the pastor. So it's pretty clear that the pastor is central in everything in the church. That's pretty much an axiom. And so my question is, if you were to read the New Testament from Matthew to Revelation, where would you find the centrality of the pastor? I don't see it. I've read the New Testament many times, and it's just not there. And yet we've built a whole infrastructure on something for which the New Testament does not highlight. And yet we've built everything on it. And thousands of books have been written about the pastorate. And yet there's no information in the New Testament about such a job description. Let me read to you from George Wolfgang Farrell's book, History of Christian Ethics. And he points out something very significant. He says, the institution most effective in helping the early Christian movement was the gradually evolving office of bishop. Now listen to this. Ethical guidance for people recently converted to Christianity and likely to bring a pervasive pagan attitude to this new life was offered at first by a polyform ministry of grace reflected in the New Testament. But as time went on, moral authority was increasingly focused in an ordered ministry of bishops and deacons. So do you see what he's saying here? He's saying that in the early church, the support of one another came from a polyform ministry, or an every member ministry of grace reflected in the New Testament. But then it shifted more to church officers, and they came into more and more control and authority. So my question is, we see he admits what was in the New Testament. Why don't we practice that? Why don't we allow the 58 one another's to take precedence over the pulpit and the sermon, which has no New Testament basis? And so we've slid from, he admits that there was a slide from simple to complex. And so we need to ask ourselves, if we're going to go by the book, the New Testament, why do we reject what is revealed there and build something that isn't even in it? That's pretty serious matter to me. And I've found scholar after scholar after scholar who says the same thing that Farrell said, that the early church was every member, one another, and then it went more and more to the bishops and the archbishops and the pope and the deacons and all the officers and all the hierarchy. So the question is, was that development good or evil? And I would suggest it was evil, because in the New Testament, we don't find that. We find the brothers and sisters caring for each other and bearing the load, sharing the load with each other. But we've shifted over to the centrality of the pastor. So the pastorate has shown itself to be very risky, and I'd like to remind you of some statistics which you've probably heard. 1,500 pastors leave the ministry each month in the USA from the unique pressures associated with their job. 80% of pastors and 84% of their spouses feel unqualified and discouraged in their roles. 80% of seminary and Bible school graduates entering the ministry will leave the ministry within the first 5 years. Now here's one, let's see here. The majority of pastors' spouses surveyed said that the most destructive event occurring in their marriage and family was the day the pastor entered the ministry. Now I think that's a pretty telling remark, and there are many other similar ones, but it's clear that the pastorate is something that's been invented. There's no New Testament basis for it, and then we've built this entire structure upon the pastorate. Is it any wonder that pastors burn out, that pastors have nervous breakdowns, that pastors' marriages fall apart, that pastors' kids have many problems? Is it any wonder? Because the onus has been put on one person, when Paul said the body is not one member, but many. So when you put all the pressure on one person, what do you expect? It's going to crack. So I would encourage you, those of you who stand behind pulpits week after week, I would encourage you to reevaluate where you're at. because you're pursuing something. You mean well, you want to help people, but the point is you're in a system that is hurting both the layman and the clergy. And the system, as again I stress, I'm not talking about the people, I'm talking about the system. The system is killing people. The system is not equipping the saints for the work of ministry. And then the pastorate is like a steamroller rolling over those who occupy its position. And I think we need to come back to the New Testament and let it speak to us that we are all brothers and sisters. It's not about having a buck stopping with a pastor. It's not about putting the load on one person. It's not about the vision of one person. We want the vision of Christ to be, in our midst. We want Him to lead us. As I spoke earlier in another session, Christ is our leader. And Christ is the one we should all look to. And I would encourage you, if you can't justify your position from the New Testament, then it would be wise to pursue other directions where we can emphasize what is in the New Testament, the 58 one another's that are clearly there. And so this is an important matter, and obviously it's an awkward one to talk to pastors who are leaders and all that, but I'm trying to share my heart with you, and I'm just giving you what I see as facts, and I just have to ask, where is the sermon in the New Testament? Where is the pulpit? Where is the pew? Where is all that? And where did the sermon come from? It came from Greek rhetoric, not from the New Testament. And so the origins of all of what's going on is very suspect. And so if it's all bogus, then why don't we reevaluate all this? And maybe there's another paradigm that we need to pursue. And I would suggest that, not to toot my own horn or anything, but I've written a book called 58 to 0, How Christ Leads Through the One Another's. And in this book, I examine the centrality of leaders in Christianity and suggest that there's a better way to love one another and to pursue one another. And I think that's what excites me, is to see the body come to life, and for the leaders to step away and let the body express Jesus Christ openly and freely. And I think that's the way of blessing. And I would encourage you to seek the Lord about this and see if He might have another direction for you to go.